Allison Kendall. Welcome to the Yoke and Abundance Wise Women podcast. It is such an honor to have you here today.
It's an honor to be here.
Can you tell folks a little bit about who you are and what you're up to in this world?
Yes, so I am a mother of two, a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and a stepmother to an 11-year-old, all boys. And I own a retail store with my mother. And beyond that, I'm a writer, an author.
Tell us a little bit about your book, please.
My book, Good Night and Good Luck, is a very personal story. It is about my journey with grief during the first year after my dad died back in 2016. So I experienced a lot of life in that first year, including my wedding and the finding out I was pregnant with my first son. So I had a lot of living and a lot of experiences that were impacted and affected by my dad's death and not being there.
So I've had the pleasure of reading it, and it's excellent. And the themes that come across so strongly to me are like holding grief and love and happiness all together at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. Feeling a realm of emotions and feelings all in the same moment.
Yeah. Can you tell folks, what's your journey to becoming an author been like?
It's been an interesting one. I can say that I have wanted to be an author, and I've dreamed of being a published author since I was in probably the 4th grade. It actually started with a recommendation from a therapist that I had been seeing as a way to kind of think through my emotions and my feelings. And I've written little short stories, little things over the years. And it's kind of always been that dream that I'm like, oh, when I'm 50, when I'm done living life and I can slow down and give time to it. That whole suffering before you can really achieve the dream you want kind of a thing.
Right.
That's not true. You can achieve it at any point. But really I used to steal away time. And I would steal away time when my stepson was napping. I would use that 1 hour to be like, oh, this is it. This is the only time I get. I can do it here. And slowly that started growing. And then I really think that it was the pivotal point of my dad's death of, I can't wait for forever. It's now time.
Yeah. The idea that I know it's so cliche, but it's something I personally come back to all the time, is that someday's not a day on the calendar. And these things that are important to us, we can't put them off.
No. And part for me was also this, everybody who I talked to about it was like my family, right? Everybody who I gave pieces of my writing to, it was always in like a friendly feedback kind of a way. And so I always had this inner thought in my mind of like, oh, they're just saying that because they're my sister or my mother or a classmate who's trying not to hurt my feelings, kind of a thing. So that inner dialogue that I had was like a barrier for me, because I was like, oh, if I put this out to real people, it's not going to get that same reception. Yeah.
So what flipped the switch for you? What finally, only 2% of the people who want to write books ever actually do it. So now you are in that 2% elite that have published a book. So what actually got you through?
So it was a conversation that you and I had in the very beginning of working together. And it was vision casting. And it was sitting there and thinking, what is it what does 5 years from now look like? What is that ultimate, if you could have everything, kind of like, what do you really want? And when it came down to it, really connecting with my inner self and my true self, and putting words to it and speaking it aloud, it was like, oh, here it is. I can't put that back in a closet.
Yeah.
I can't stuff that back away. It's now in my mind. It's now that image of sitting behind a table in a library or in a bookstore and having a line of people in front of me for me to sign my book, me being in talking engagements and speaking events, like that image became so strong when I vocalized it, that it was like, this is what has to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm really curious for you, what every time we say yes to one thing, we're saying no to other things. So like by saying yes to writing this book, how did it impact your life? Like what did you have to say no to because you were writing this book? I mean, you're a mom of 3 kids, really.
Yeah.
And you're running a business and you're married and you have friends. Like, how did this impact your life?
Yeah. So I had to change up bedtime, which was hard. Like there were some nights where I just had to say, you know what, mommy can't put you to bed tonight. Mommy's got to work. And that's that was one of the things that I did, is I changed the way that I talked about it. Mommy's got to go upstairs and mommy's got to work. Mommy's working on a book. And like, even though they don't fully get it, I needed to be able to have that conversation, I think mostly for myself. And I also think that it's something that they'll be able to go back to, because it's not my only book. I'm going to do more. Like this is going to become a thing for them. So I think the adjustments in the family was the biggest, personally. And then even with work, I had to step away from being in the store all the time. So I changed my presence in the store, which affected the business, but it also allowed me to look at how the business can run and how the employees that we've hired, it allowed me to see them in a different light and have an appreciation for them and for what we've built. And to know that if I'm not able to be there all the time, it still is a functioning and thriving business.
Wow. That is so cool.
Yeah.
What has been most surprising to you in this? Like when you thought about like what it would be like to be an author, and when you originally started, what did you picture? And like, what was it actually like? Instagram versus reality? Like, what did you picture and what was the reality?
So the way that I've always pictured writing is like being alone in a dark room, getting no sleep and staying up until like 5 a.m. and just like hounding away and like just flowing from like brain to keyboard to pen to paper, like whatever the medium, like just that constant of like no stop, just giving everything. And the reality is that it was 30 minutes here, an hour there, trying to battle a blank page, trying to get into the moment to write, because time wasn't just readily available all the time.
Right.
So having to make time for it,
yeah,
I think was the big change, or the big difference between my view.
I'm really curious. How did you combat? I think so. I'll start off by saying, I think that for me, one of the most surprising things about this process was the amount of self-doubt that I encountered. Like yesterday, somebody asked me, I was speaking actually to my high school yesterday, and it was quite the honor and really cool. I was speaking to the creative writing and AP classes. And I asked like they're not kids, the students. I asked the students, what do you picture a writer to be? And one of them was like an expert in their field. And I was like, let's myth bust that right now. You aren't an expert and then write about the book. You learn about it and write about it. And that process of writing about it makes you an expert. So that was like one thing that I was like myth busting for them. And because that is actually the process for a lot of people. I mean, there are people who are experts in their field and then go write a book about that thing that they've spent 10 years researching, but I don't actually think that's the norm. Because of that, the amount of self-doubt I had to battle every time I was on the page, like looking at that blank page, was a lot. I'm curious if that's something you encountered.
Yeah, self-doubt was definitely like a big hurdle, a wall for me. It was, for me, it showed up in ways of who's really going to care about my story? Who's going to care about the fact that my dad wasn't at my wedding? Who's going to care about how difficult the father-daughter dance has become for me? Like, why is my story and how is my story going to resonate with anybody? And it was like that's where the self-doubt came in for me, was how am I going to translate across? And am I? Or is this just something that I'm making up in my own head?
Right. So how did you get through that? Like, what did you do?
Well, my first draft, my first shitty draft of the book, it was there. You could see it. I didn't open up as much. I held back a lot. I tried to make it more relatable in terms of removing myself and the personal experience from it. And then I gave it to beta readers, and there's something missing. We need more. We want you. The reason why people want to read the book is because they want my experience. And that was something that I couldn't get around. So really it was the feedback of other people and letting other people read that shitty first draft and hearing what they had to say.
Yeah.
And then that's when I was like, oh, here's my sibling. Here's the name. Stop referring to people as if I'm distanced from them.
Right.
And bringing people in. And that was, that truly changed the whole book.
I don't know who said it, but that idea that the personal is universal, like that was really surprising to me. I think that's what you're like hitting at. It's like, we need to hear like the minute details of your personal experience to feel connected to it, to feel that universal grief and empathy and compassion, and like that place where it's like we're touching hearts. Yeah. Was there anything else that you did to help you get into the experience of writing, like to drop in when you needed to?
Yeah, so I tried a few different things. I listened to music to help. I have an old flannel shirt of my dad's that I would put on in the beginning when I was like first starting to, and I would cozy up with that and kind of like help, like still smell and like feel like I was close to him. There were a couple times like I wrote letters to him, and some of those letters are in the book. They're actually one of my favorite parts of the book. So there were times in the writing process where I would write to him about what I was doing. And then the other thing was that I actually would burn sage, and I would say a mantra of like, my kids are okay. The store is okay. Like all the things that would allow me to like kind of drop into that space.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how I ended up really diving in during the real editing, when it got really busy and really hard and a lot of time. That was probably the
Yeah.
most that I was being pulled away from people.
Well, your book touches on like so much, like family and familial roles and grief and love and heartbreak. And I'm curious, like, what do you hope readers will take away the most from your book?
It's okay to grieve.
Mm.
And it's okay to be in pain 1 second and happy in the next.
Mm.
Those emotions, feeling them all at the same time, is okay. And that feeling like you're a ping pong ball is normal.
Mm.
I want people to feel like they're seen, because for me, in the whole grieving process up until writing the book, I felt very alone, even though I was surrounded by people and I had so much support and so much love. And it wasn't necessarily something that I realized until it came time to write the book,
Mm.
was that I didn't have anybody who had lost a parent.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of my friends, their grandparents are still alive. None of mine are. So for me, I felt like I was the first one to experience something,
Yeah.
and I didn't know how to navigate that.
Yeah.
But death and loss and grief is something that we all experience in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. What did the process of writing this book, what did it teach you about your own grief?
That I buried it.
Oh.
That there was so much that I just like in the writing, when I distanced myself from it at first, there was so much that I just pushed down. Writing the book was the most that I was able to grieve since his death. And I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Yeah. Writing a book is never just about writing a book, is it?
No, no, not at all.
It's so interesting to me. You touched on a piece of your book a moment ago. You talked about the letters, that like that is a thread throughout the entire book, are the letters to your dad, and they're really beautiful and touching. And I still write to my dad every day, so it's really relatable to me, even though my dad has been gone since 2019. And you are kind of creating a project around that. Can you share what it is you're doing and what you hope it will do for others?
Yeah. So I have a space on my website where people can submit letters, because I found that for myself, writing to my dad helped keep him close.
Mm-hmm.
It helped make him feel like he was there for things that he wasn't there for. And it was comforting. It was like a warm blanket, and it allowed me to express feelings and emotions when I wanted to bury them.
Mm.
So there are some letters where I am really angry, and that's okay. The anger is okay too. The anger, the sadness, the joy, all of those emotions show up in the way that I write to him.
Yeah.
And I think that writing letters to loved ones, writing letters to pets, writing letters to an old version of ourselves that we no longer are, all of that is grieving. And that is all an experience that I think that the practice of writing letters can help us navigate.
Yeah. And grief is such, like, we're talking about it right now in terms of death, and you just touched on it in terms of like writing the letter to the old self
Mhm.
And I think about like I recently had like kind of a really painful friend breakup, and the grief around losing that relationship, and the grief around when a book is done. Like when you just fell in love with a book and you close the end of the chapter, like there's sometimes this feeling of grief in that, of that those characters are now gone from your consciousness, or um the grief. This happened. I wear clothes until they are on their very last thread. And then by the time they're gone, it's like not even something I can give to Goodwill because they are like threadbare. Right. And so, like, the grief of not being able to wear that favorite shirt anymore. And I know that's trite, but it's like all of these little griefs, they compound. And
Mhm.
then when you have a really big grief, like losing someone, like the death of someone that's so close, it's like it rips the scab of all of those
Mhm.
other griefs behind it, be it lost loved ones or the little griefs. And so sometimes you're like, it's like not just one thing that you're grieving at any one time. So I'm like, that you are giving people. So I want to be clear to folks. You on your website, you have a submission portal where they can go and they can write a letter to anyone or anything around grief. And then you're going to be publishing these. Am I correct? Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about what that's going to look like and where these, I mean, it reminds me, I've told you this already, but it reminds me of like Post Secret, but in a way to express these like this pain and longing and grief. So share
Yeah.
more about what it's going to look like.
Yeah. It's like I want it to feel like it's a release, like a letting go, so that people aren't having to hold those feelings and emotions in all the time. I feel like that's like a really important part. And they're going to live like like an archive on the website, like as if it's a blog.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to be sending out newsletters and featuring different letters in that, and with the hope that, you know, maybe someday there will be a book of letters
Oh,
for
wow.
people, a collection of just these raw, unfiltered emotions, and they can be anonymous. They can be completely anonymous, or they can be like addressed to someone.
Mm,
It can be it can be whatever the person writing it needs it to be for
yeah.
that release, for that letting go.
And what
You know, I think
exactly are you calling it? What's the name that you've given to this project?
letters to loved ones.
Letters to loved ones.
And that's like, I know for a lot of people, I know many people have seasonal affective disorder, or depression.
Yeah, both. I mean, they go hand in hand.
And I know that like for some people, it's like a goodbye to summer,
Yeah.
like a grieving of a season, a grieving of a time in our lives. You know, after I have friends who, after being pregnant, they feel out of touch from their own body
Mm,
because they had been carrying this life within them and with them, and now their baby is with them living,
mhm.
and there's like a grieving of the pregnancy. So like there's all these little things, like what you're saying, like when you have the big grief, sometimes it rips open all of
Mhm.
these other experiences that we have that we aren't necessarily aware of, or that we haven't fully dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You know, I hate to ask you this because you're like, but I'm going to ask you anyway. I'm just going to say that right now. What do you envision is next for you?
So next for me is there was a lot of tears in writing this book. There's a lot of pain and a lot of hard times. So next for me is happiness.
Mm.
um I think next for me is actually going to be a children's book.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
at least in the workings. So we'll see where that goes, but I have like 5 different projects that I'm have like on the back burner that I'm just
Yeah.
waiting to dive into. But I think having a little fun with the children's book and some joy
Right. Yeah.
will
That's
be in the
awesome.
plan.
What do you most hope folks will take away from your book?
The feeling of a conversation with a friend.
Mm, yeah, that's so beautiful. I'm curious what else you want listeners to know about you, the book, the process of becoming an author.
I miss my dad every day.
Mm,
I think about him every day. I see him in my sons. I see him in the change of the seasons. I hear him in the sound of a geese flying overhead. Um, he's gone, but he's here.
mm,
And I think that that's something that I want people to know, that they can always have them near.
yeah, yeah. And they always are near. Well, then, my last question for you is, how do you live a life of abundance?
I'm going to say with my boys,
Yeah,
with walking through this phase of my life,
right.
with them and carrying them through.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. Well, Allie, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It is a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.